Imagine this. One July morning in 1854, on the Magnolia Bend plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, two black men were forced to stand beneath a cotton-draped arch and marry two identical twin women. And from that day forward, the county death records began to quietly mark the undoing of every white soul who had ordered it. It was the kind of ceremony that had nothing to do with love. The courtyard before the big house shimmered in the heat. Edward Harrow, master of the plantation, stood with his cane and ledger. The preacher from the First Baptist of Natchez, Reverend Milton Greeley, wiped sweat from his brow and read verses about obedience and fruitful unions. They called it a Christian order, though everyone knew what it really was: an investment. Samuel, the plantation blacksmith, stood with his shirt clean but frayed at the collar. He was tall, quiet, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Jonah, newly bought from an auction in Natchez, still bore the faint scars of shackles on his wrists. The women before them, Lena and Lila, were known in the quarters as the Mirror Sisters, laundresses who worked side by side and slept shoulder to shoulder. Their closeness made the overseers uneasy. Harrow had decided that binding them into two marriages would make them useful. The preacher raised his hand. "Take your wives' hands," he said. They obeyed. But behind their backs, unseen by most, Lena and Lila reached for each other's fingers and gripped so tightly that the sound of their knuckles cracked through the still air. Reverend Greeley paused, startled. At that same moment, inside the house, a great French mirror in the parlor fractured down the middle. A white child fainted, though the day was not so hot. Outside, a black shimmer of crows circled the roof and landed on the ridge beam above the porch, silent as a jury. In the slave quarters, an old woman named Aunt Mabel whispered to the one beside her, "Never bind four souls when the river water stands like glass. The Lord won't know which one he's called." No one spoke as the preacher finished his verses. Harrow signed the page in his family ledger. He'd already prepared the credit papers with the Natchez Commercial Bank. New breeding stock noted in the margin as security for a growing debt. He smiled as if the act of forcing vows from other people's mouths might somehow steady his accounts. The men didn't look at their brides. The brides didn't look at the men. They all stared at the ground, at the small, trembling line of ants moving toward the shade. When the preacher said, "Amen," Samuel thought he heard the word echo from somewhere else. Low, doubled, as if spoken twice in the same breath. That night, the air hung heavy. From the river came no ripple, no frog, no wind. Only the whisper of two women repeating something soft and rhythmic in a tongue older than English, their hands still clasped, even as they lay apart. Decades later, the county probate ledgers would tell one story. Within 10 years of that July day, 3 white heirs of the Harrow family died of fever. The plantation slipped into distress, and by 1865, Magnolia Bend ceased to turn profit or crop. But in the black oral memory, the explanation was simpler. That day, the master made a contract with something stronger than the bank. There's one small detail that never made it into the Harrow papers or Reverend Greeley's church journal. Just before stepping beneath the cotton arch, one twin leaned toward the man meant for her sister and whispered a few words, not meant for white ears. Many years later, he would tell a listener, "In that moment, I knew we weren't just marrying each other. We were marrying their blood to our anger." And that was the true beginning, not of a wedding, but of a reckoning that would outlast every ledger Edward Harrow ever signed. When people speak of the twins from Cypress Bend, they call it a legend. But it isn't. It's written, in ink, in ledgers, in the private notes of a doctor who thought he'd seen everything a body could do. And before we go deeper, take a moment. Tell me where you're listening from. North, deep south, Midwest. Each place has its own ghosts, its own way of hearing stories like this. Leave a note in the comments. It matters, because this tale doesn't only belong to Florida, it belongs to America. If you find yourself drawn to the dark corners of history, the ones the school books skip, make sure you stay with us. Subscribe, tap the bell, whatever it takes not to lose the thread. Because what you're about to hear isn't just about a strange pair of boys. It's about what happens when a system built on ownership meets something it cannot name. Elias and Isaiah weren't the first enslaved children to suffer. But when pain crossed from one body to another, the world around them faltered. You see, the plantation order depended on predictability. Cotton, obedience, punishment, profit. The white mind could live with cruelty, but not with mystery. When Elias was whipped and his brother screamed miles away, the white men didn't fear the boys themselves. They feared what it meant, that these children, classed as property, might share a thread beyond science or scripture, that a connection between them could defy the order of master and slave. From that day, every theory they had about control began to tremble. Doctors talked of nervous imitation. Preachers warned of Satan's deception. But the truth was simpler, more dangerous. Something in those boys refused to stay within the boundaries of ownership. And the record trail they left, thin as it is, shows how far men went to deny what they'd witnessed. In the Leon County archives, there's still a gap, a torn stretch of paper where a punishment entry should have been. The plantation. Ledger lists 11 beatings for the year 1861. The same months appear in the diary of a Tallahassee physician, Dr. Walter Keene, who logged 22 injuries, 11 pairs to be exact. Each wound reproduced in duplicate. Keene's own journal survived, just barely. Found in the 1930s by his grandson in a collapsing trunk, its pages smell of mildew and iodine. One note reads, subjects, colored male twins, approximately 10 years, marked by synchronous lesions. Possible hysterical sympathy, though force of manifestation exceeds known examples. Around the same time, a minister in Tallahassee, Reverend Samuel Pratt of First Methodist, recorded a sermon about 2 colored children in whom the devil mocks the whip of Christian order. His handwriting shakes halfway through the paragraph, as if he wasn't sure who he was warning against. Not long after, someone excised whole pages from the church registry. Another hand scribbled, unfit for record. Even in the courthouse basement today, you can see the absences. Missing folios, burn marks on one corner of an evidence book, as if the paper itself wanted to forget. Yet the stories didn't vanish. In the 1930s, during the WPA interviews, an aged woman named Rebecca Ann told a young interviewer, "Them twins, they take what the white man do to one, and the other bleed too. I seen it. Some folks say God mark them. Some say devil. I say, they was tied by something older than both." Fragments like that scattered across county lines, like ash after a fire. Before the war ended, one of the twins came under the eye of the Confederate Army's medical staff, listed in a field report as interesting nervous case from Florida. After that, nothing but silence. The records were sealed, later misplaced. And here's where our path turns back again. Because to understand how a boy could feel another's pain from miles away, we must return to the night they entered this world, to the mother who bore them, to the woman who whispered over their cradle that they were one spirit split in two. If we don't begin there, none of what follows will make sense. So next, we go back to the year 1849, before the first lash, before the word secession turned men into armies. Back to the storm that brought Elias and Isaiah into the world. It began long before the Civil War, before the world learned the word secession. In 1849, On a night so heavy with rain, it seemed the sky itself was pressing down. A woman named Rachel labored inside the dim heat of the Cypress Bend slave quarters. The air dripped from the low beams, thick with the smell of pine tar and fear. Thunder rolled over the swamp, and each time it cracked, the shutters trembled as if the world outside were alive and watching. Rachel was young, but already marked by grief. The children she'd borne before were gone, sold, buried, forgotten. This time she whispered to the dark, "Not these two. Don't take these two." Beside her moved Aunt Millie, the old midwife and conjure woman, her hands sure, her eyes milky from years of smoke and salt water. She had come from the Georgia coast long ago, carrying the cadence of the Gula tongues in her prayers. She laid her ear to Rachel's belly and said, "2 heartbeats, same rhythm. That ain't 2 lives. It's one trying to find itself twice." When the first boy came, he was quiet, still as a shadow. The second followed with a cry, sharp enough to slice through thunder, and in that instant, the first one's lungs opened, matching the other's wail note for note. Millie froze. Even the frogs outside seemed to hush. She said later that the air had gone flat as a whip before it falls. They named them Elias and Isaiah. Born slaves, but joined by something no master would ever understand. Rachel watched them grow beneath the cypress trees, where moss hung like gray mourning cloth. They slept curled together, small fists locked. When one laughed, the other smiled before hearing the joke. When one turned his head, the other's eyes followed as if pulled by invisible thread. By the time they could walk, the quarters already whispered. Some said they were a blessing, others a warning. Aunt Millie called them twin spirit and told Rachel to keep them close. Don't let no white man split what the ancestors tied. Life on the plantation was a slow grind of sunrise and labor. Children carried water, chased off crows, picked weeds until their fingers cracked. Yet even in that routine, the boys stood apart. One afternoon, when the heat shimmered and the air hummed with cicadas, Isaiah fell from a persimmon tree, twisting his leg. He screamed, and a half-mile away, inside a dim cabin, Elias clutched the same leg, his cry echoing his brother's. When they brought him out, both boys limped. After that, no one called it coincidence. Old Jacob muttered that it wasn't natural. Dinah, who feared the lash more than the devil, crossed herself and whispered of double spirits that brought trouble to the quarters. But Rachel saw something else. She saw protection in their bond, a kind of mercy after years of loss. She told Millie, "Maybe the Lord tied them so I wouldn't lose another child." Millie only shook her head. "Or maybe he tied them so you'd remember what it cost when white men try to break what's whole." As the seasons turned, the boys grew into wiry children with steady eyes. The overseer barely noticed them, until work began to slow in the summer of '57. That was when one of them, trying to shield an older man from punishment, drew the first real blow. What happened that day would end every secret the quarters had kept. For years, the people had whispered their prayers, hoping the White House never learned of the boys' strange link. But in 1857, when a whip cracked through the field, and 2 bodies answered at once, silence was no longer an option. And that was the beginning of what the ledgers later called the first recorded incident. After the forced wedding, silence settled over Magnolia Bend like dust that refused to lift. The field hands whispered that the day had bent the air itself, that the soil would never again sleep easy. Samuel, Jonah, Lena, and Lila were placed in one cabin by the river, a narrow structure of warped boards, its roof patched with burlap and hope. To Harrow it seemed efficient. 4 bodies, 1 purpose. But to the quarters, it looked like a cage built for a heartbeat, with 4 chambers. At night, they lay not as 2 couples, but as one shape. Lena and Lila slept back to back, fingers intertwined even in dreams. Samuel's arm rested across one twin, Jonah's across the other, so that each touched all the others in some quiet way. Aunt Charity later called it a knot too tight for the Lord or the Master to undo. Days turned to weeks, and strange harmonies began to appear. When Samuel burned his hand at the forge, Jonah, half a field away, felt heat pulse across his own palm. When Lila laughed, Lena's breath caught as if someone had reached into her chest. Once, during a storm, Samuel dreamed of drowning, while Lila woke, choking on air thick as river water. They never spoke of it loudly. The walls had ears, and fear moved quicker than rumor. Then came the dream. All 4 saw it on the same night. The big house standing in shallow water, the reflection of its columns rippling with each thunderclap. White figures dressed in mourning sat on the veranda, their faces hollow and pale, while a ring of black children circled them, whispering lullabies. When they told Aunt Charity, she crossed herself and muttered, "If the house stands in the river in your dreams, its floorboards already know the flood." The others grew wary. Some slaves began to avoid the river cabin, muttering that it hummed at night, that you could hear 2 voices praying in one breath. A few brave ones still came quietly, leaving charms, coins, or herbs at the threshold, offerings of fear and faith. One evening, Charity brought 4 small pouches stitched from faded linen. Inside each, roots, salt, a twist of hair. She told them to keep them close, to never untie the cords until the house begins to sicken with your sickness. Her eyes trembled with something that looked like pride and pity at once. That night, under the black arch of cypress trees, the 4 met by the river where the air smelled of mud and iron. They made a circle, holding hands, the same way they had been forced to stand at the wedding. But this time, no preacher, no master, only the pulse of the river and a single flame trembling in Samuel's hand. Each spoke in turn. Samuel said, "I don't vow to love, I vow to remember." Jonah said, "I won't be meek, I vow not to die alone." Lena and Lila whispered something older, then English, words Aunt Charity once murmured while burning herbs for the dead. The candlelight bent in the wind. Together they said, "If they take from us, let them lose the same." It wasn't a curse, not as they meant it. It was balance, a plea for the world to see them as more than bodies in another man's ledger. But when Samuel blew out the flame, a cold wind swept over the river, raising gooseflesh on their arms. That same night, Edward Harrow's eldest son was thrown from his horse. His arm shattered in 2 places. The doctor said he would never ride again. In the Harrow family papers, the event was listed as a small riding accident. In the quarters, Aunt Charity only said, "When you tie 4 souls with one thread, the pull goes both ways." By morning, the rumor had already begun its crawl through the fields, that the river had chosen a side, and that Magnolia Bend was breathing unevenly. Months after the Cotton Arch wedding, Magnolia Bend grew quieter on the surface, but under that calm, something began to tilt. It started, as such things often do, in the bodies of women. Lena's belly was the first to swell. Lila's monthly bleeding stopped soon after. Both moved through the yard with the same gray fatigue and sour stomach, leaning on each other when they thought no one watched. Up at the big house, Mary Harrow, wife to Edward's surviving son, also carried new life. Harrow spoke of future heirs and growing assets in the same breath. Then, one choking night, Lena doubled over on the pallet, blood staining the rags beneath her. Her muscles clenched and refused to let go. Aunt Charity pressed her hand to that hard, trembling belly and whispered every prayer she knew. Across the yard, lanterns lit the stairs to the big house as Mary's screams tore down the hall. 2 rooms, 2 women, the same rising panic. By dawn, the picture had changed, but not evenly. In the quarters, Lena lay exhausted, pulse thready but steady. When Charity laid her ear to that swollen skin, she heard a small, stubborn thump. "Still here," she said, almost in disbelief. Upstairs, Dr. Amos Ridley sat back from Mary Harrow's bed, with blood on his cuffs and a heaviness in his shoulders. He had listened and listened for a sound that did not return. Finally, he wrote in his neat private book, "Probable miscarriage. Fetal life absent at first light." Later that day, Harrow insisted Ridley look at Lena for the sake of the property. The doctor went down into the yard, pinched a bit of snuff from his box, and stooped over the pallet where Lena lay. He listened again, this time to a heartbeat, strong as a drum at a dance. In his personal journal, not the one he showed other men, he allowed himself one honest sentence. "It is as if the strength that might have saved Mrs. Harrow chose instead to preserve the Negro woman's child." Stories ran faster than ink. Among the enslaved, people began to murmur that whenever sickness circled the big house, someone in the quarters rose from the edge of death. A fever that should have taken a boy broke overnight. A cough that sounded like the grave quieted by morning. Always, it seemed, on the same nights when a lamp burned late behind the Harrows' curtains. Reverend Milton Greeley heard whispers after Sunday preaching. One old woman, tired of being told to accept God's will only when it ran one way, said to him, "Maybe the Lord just dragging a little mercy down where he don't see enough." He stiffened. In his church notebook, he did not quote her exactly. He wrote instead, "Dangerous notions among Negroes. Talk of balance between house and quarters. Smacks of devilment." Edward Harrow noticed it in a different ledger. 2 lost pregnancies upstairs, none below. Fewer dead children in the slave lists than any man in Natchez would expect for such hard years. At the same time, cotton rotted in the field after late floods. Bullworms chewed through what the storms left standing. Bank figures began to lean the wrong way. Over supper with a Natchez commercial bank agent, Harrow poured another drink and complained. The banker shrugged. Rumors of unlucky ground, he said, could shave the value off any property. "Don't let that talk run wild," he advised. "You keep your people in line. Discipline, not stories." Back on Magnolia Bend, Harrow's eye kept drifting toward one cabin by the river. Time and again, when a white child failed or a lady took to her bed, it was Samuel and Jonah's women who bore strong infants, or they themselves who somehow stood hale through fever weather. The children of that 4-fold household seemed cut from one stubborn cloth, alert, wide-eyed, rarely sick. One afternoon, Harrow paused in the yard and really looked. Lena cradled a baby at her breast, dark eyes fixed on his face. Beside her, Lila's hands were empty, yet her expression was the same. Jaw tight, gaze protective, as if she, too, felt every twitch of that small body. A chill crept up his spine that had nothing to do with weather. "If there's any witch work on this place," he muttered to his overseer, "it's living in that cabin." He did not yet know whether to fear it or break it, but he knew he could not ignore it. Ridley counseled caution, more observation, a closer watch on births and illnesses. Greeley urged a different remedy, a public Sabbath lesson, where the 4 would be made to renounce any heathen vows and proclaim that their children, their bodies, their souls, belonged first to God and then to Harrow. The banker, though absent, had already cast his vote, whatever preserved the value of the land. Between them, A rough plan took shape. Some mix of humiliation and separation, perhaps even sail down river for one of the men. They had not yet settled on which knife to use. But in the river cabin, word of these conversations seeped in through kitchen mouths and field whispers. Samuel, Jonah, Lena, and Lila sat in the half-dark and understood a simple, brutal truth. Whatever the master chose to do to their knot, he would be doing to the bones of Magnolia Bend itself. And from that moment on, every new birth and every fresh grave on that land would feel, to them, like another tug on the rope they had tied under the cypress trees. Harrow chose a Sunday. The sky was a hard blue, the kind that makes heat feel sharper. A bell clanged from the veranda, calling everyone out. Field hands, house servants, children with bare feet and wary eyes drifted into the yard and formed a rough semicircle. At the center stood Samuel, Jonah, Lena, and Lila, facing the big house with their backs to their own people. Reverend Greeley arrived with his Bible and a thin, set mouth. Harrow greeted him briefly, then turned to the crowd. "Some of you," he said, letting his gaze sweep the faces, "have forgotten that any promise on this land lives or dies by my word. There's been talk, marriages that mean more than they should, notions about power that doesn't come from God or your master." He gestured to the four. "These here will remind you who orders your steps." Greeley opened his Bible and chose verses about servants obeying their masters, wives submitting, God blessing fruitful households. Then he stepped close to Samuel. "Repeat after me," he said. "My marriage is a kindness from my master." Samuel's jaw flexed. "My marriage is what he allows," he answered, carefully avoiding the word. Greeley frowned but moved on to Jonah, then to the women. "Say it," he told Lena. "Your children belong first to the Lord and to your master, who provides." Lena stared past him at nothing. "My children belong to the Lord," she said. "To your master," he insisted. Her lips thinned. Beside her, Lila's fingers closed around her hand, knuckles blanching. "We ain't his calves," Lena murmured, too low for most to hear. But Harrow caught it in the tightness of her mouth. "Enough," he snapped. "Strip the men." Samuel and Jonah were forced to their knees, shirts yanked away. The overseer's strap whistled through the air and fell across Samuel's back. The crack seemed to slice the yard in two. Some of the children flinched as if struck. Lena made a sound like someone had stepped on her chest. Lila's body jerked in time with each blow, though no leather touched her skin. Jonah's turn came next. Each impact drew blood and dust, and the hiss of men clenching their teeth to keep from crying out. When one stroke landed too high and Jonah gasped, a ripple went through the crowd. Several people swore later that they saw the same red mark rise along Samuel's ribs, where the strap had not fallen. It was during that beating that Samuel lifted his head, sweat and blood running together, and shouted, not to Harrow, but to the watching faces on both sides of the yard. "You think you just cutting me?" he cried. "You hitting what holds your house up?" For a heartbeat, even the birds seemed to still. Then the strap fell again. At that exact hour, up in the big house, Clara Harrow sat in the library, going over her father's papers, maps of fields, loan notes from Natchez, careful lists of projected births and yields. A lamp on the edge of the desk tipped as if brushed by an invisible hand. Oil spilled. Flame ran like quick water across the newest sheets. The fire licked through the columns of figures, curling them into black lace. It stopped at the older family letters, as though some unseen line had been drawn. By the time servants smothered the blaze, the latest plans for Magnolia Bend's future lay in ash, while the past sat practically untouched. Out in the yard, as Samuel and Jonah were dragged aside, Edward Harrow's eldest son rode in, angry at having missed the show. He spurred his horse toward the gathering, laughing. The animal shied, no snake, no hole, just a wild start, and threw him hard onto the packed earth. He did not rise. Later, in Dr. Ridley's handwriting, the entry read, "Severe injury to spine. Prognosis poor. Ambulation unlikely." The date matched the Sunday education in Ridley's other notes. That night, in the quarters, people spoke in low voices. "They laid leather on our men, and the ground kicked back at theirs," someone said. Aunt Charity shook her head slowly. "Land been listening," she told Lena and Lila. "You tied your hurt to theirs when you spoke by that river. Now, every time they sharpen the knife on you, a piece of their own bone feels it." In the big house, Greeley urged prayer, humility, repentance. "There's disorder here," he told Harrow. "If you don't root it out, it may shame your name before men." Harrow heard only the part about shame. To him, the broken son, the burned papers, the murmurs in the yard were not warnings to loosen his grip, but signs he needed to squeeze harder. In the river cabin that evening, the four sat in the half-light, shoulders bandaged, faces drawn. "This on me," Samuel whispered. "My mouth brought it on that boy." Jonah shook his head. "They been taking from us since before we could talk. Maybe this the first time they feel the weight of it." Lena stared at her hands. "I didn't ask for their child to fall just so ours could stand," she said. "I wanted our babies to live, but not like this." Lila met her eyes, twin to twin. "We tied a knot," she said quietly. "Now it's pulling everything it touches. Us, them, this place." Outside, the river moved on, slow and dark, as if it knew the plantation was already leaning. Harrow, refusing to see the tilt, made one clear decision. He would not let four enslaved people carry such unseen power under his roof. And from that resolve came the next step. Not mercy, but a search for some way to break the knot, even if it meant breaking the people in it. By the late 1850s, Magnolia Bend was thinner at the edges. War talk drifted up the river, banks grew tighter, and in the cabin by the water, the Knott family had begun to multiply. 2 small children clung to Lena's skirts now, and 1 to Lila's. Another weight was growing under Lena's ribs. The little ones looked so alike that people joked Samuel and Jonah had stamped them out of the same mold. Dark, sharp-eyed, each with a faint pale ring around the throat, like the memory of a rope that had never touched them. Aunt Charity called it the mark of the tying. Up at the big house, Mary Harrow labored through yet another pregnancy. Clara coughed through thin handkerchiefs and stayed mostly indoors. Ridley visited more often, his bag heavier with bottles and folded notes. The pattern everyone whispered about did not stop. 1 month, Mary's body failed her again. The pains came early and wrong. By dawn, the upstairs room had gone quiet except for the rustle of linen and a single, flat sentence in Ridley's formal book. Stillbirth. Maternal condition fragile. That same night in the river cabin, Lena, who had been close to losing her child for weeks, suddenly cooled. Her fever broke. The baby within kicked so hard she cried out. Later that year, when Mary managed to carry another pregnancy almost to term, Ridley told himself things would be different. But on the night her labor turned dangerous, the same seesaw returned. Upstairs, the fetal heartbeat slowed. Downstairs, Lila, whose own belly was only partway rounded, clutched herself with a rip of pain, as if something inside her were being dragged forward too soon. By sunrise, 1 white infant lay wrapped in silence in the big house. In the cabin, a black newborn protested the world at the top of its lungs, though every sign had said it should not have made it. Ridley's private journal, separate from the book he showed other gentlemen, began to fill with double entries. For each loss in house, he penciled in a line about unusually vigorous Negro infant born same date. One night, after too much coffee and too little sleep, he wrote in a cramped hand, "If this were not about Negroes and planters, I would say aloud there is a transfer of fortune between house and quarters." He underlined "would" twice, then shut the book. In the cabin, the cost was clear in different ways. Lena and Lila moved like women twice their age. Some mornings, Lila woke with her arms wrapped around her belly, sobbing that she felt hollowed out, though she wasn't with child. Samuel's joints ached worst on days when word came that someone in the big house had taken to bed. Jonah started waking in the night with his teeth hurting, as if he'd been grinding them through other people's dreams. "You asked for them to pay," Aunt Charity told them, her voice rough. "Didn't think about the toll collector. Every time something crosses that bridge, it go through you first." Samuel, a man of hammers and measures, tried to make sense of it in the only way he knew. On a low beam in the cabin, he carved small marks, one shape for births in the quarters, another for deaths and miscarriages in the house. After a few years, the pattern stared back at him, clusters that never quite matched, but never really parted either. He showed it to Jonah one evening. "Look here. Every time we get another child, they bury one of theirs, or near enough." Jonah traced the cuts with a finger. "So whose hand holds the scale?" he asked. "Ain't ours. We just the metal they laying their weight on." Out beyond their counting, larger forces were moving. Cotton prices shivered, letters from New Orleans came slower, and talk of secession grew louder than the frogs at night. Yet inside that small, damp cabin, the balance between two families, two worlds, kept quietly shifting, breath by breath. If you've ever heard older folks in your family talk about strange give and take in births and deaths, how one life seemed to arrive on the back of another's departure, you'll know this feeling. If you're from Mississippi or Louisiana and grew up with stories about river plantations, I'd be curious to hear them in the comments. Dr. Ridley didn't know it, but the private ledger he was building, half science, half unease, would someday be one of the few witnesses Magnolia Bend left behind. Before that could happen, though, the men in charge were going to try one last thing. Stop treating this as fate and turn it into a case, something they could examine, control, and, if necessary, erase. Edward Harrow no longer slept through the night. The wind over the river seemed to murmur his name, and every flicker of lamplight in the hall looked like a ledger burning again. He wanted an answer, medical, holy, or otherwise, that would give shape to the unease clawing through his house. He summoned Dr. Ridley and Reverend Greeley. "Tell me," he said, "what curse lives in my soil? I need it named." Ridley hesitated. He had seen too much to dismiss it as gossip, yet too little to admit what he suspected. Greeley called it spiritual rot, insisting that the answer lay in prayer and punishment. Between them, Harrow found something that sounded like control, an observation plan. Ridley proposed a closer study, purely scientific, he said, a way to prove or disprove the whispers. The four, the blacksmith, the field hand, and the twin wives, would be moved to a storage room near the kitchen, within reach of the big house, for better monitoring. Harrow agreed instantly. So they were brought inside the compound's heart, beneath the same roof as the people who owned them. The walls were brick instead of boards, the floor packed earth. A single lamp hung above, its light thin and watchful. To the other slaves, it looked like a promotion. To Samuel, Jonah, Lena, and Lila, it felt like being pinned under glass. Ridley visited daily, his tone gentle, but his hands cold and measuring. He recorded pulse, breath, temperature. When Mary Harrow fell ill, he wrote both sets of numbers side by side, hers and Lila's. When the Reverend came to pray, he kept his instruments ready, scribbling each time one of the four winced or flinched at a holy word. One afternoon, Greeley performed what he called a cleansing session. He read aloud from the Epistle of James, the line about resisting the devil. With every blood of Christ, Lena's heart thudded so violently that the lamp chain trembled. Samuel pressed his hands to his ears. Jonah staggered, as though hearing the echo in his own chest. Ridley's pen hesitated, then continued its quiet scratching. Later, he wrote in his private notebook, "Religious speech appears to elicit physical reaction, if not hysteria, then some shared nervous network between subjects. Cannot explain without venturing into forbidden ground." Forbidden ground was exactly where Greeley lived. He began to demand confession, wanted each of the four to renounce pagan vows. One by one, they repeated his words, but under their breath, the twins murmured something older, half English, half from the memory of Aunt Charity's tongue. When he heard it, the Reverend's skin went pale as linen. "You mock the Lord," he whispered, but the word shook. Afterward, he told Harrow, "Sell them. Send them downriver before the contagion spreads." Ridley objected. "Science demands further study," he said. "If the connection is real, it could yield knowledge worth more than the whole field of cotton." Then, realizing his mistake, he added quickly, "To medicine, I mean." Harrow liked that idea. Profit dressed as reason. He even wrote to an acquaintance at a New Orleans medical college, offering a family of interest for discreet acquisition. The Reverend was horrified. "You'd invite godless men to dissect what you should destroy?" "Better sold than haunting my books," Harrow replied. In the dark kitchen corridor, a housemaid named Ruth overheard enough to carry the news to the river cabin. That night, the four sat together, children asleep in the corner. Samuel's fists clenched on his knees. Jonah said nothing for a long time. Then, "If they mean to sell us as a lesson, we'll teach them one first." Lila trembled. "You seen what happens when we pull too hard," she said. "Every time it hurts them, it hurts us too." Samuel's eyes found hers. "Then maybe it's time to aim the pain higher, not to a person, to this place." They began whispering about changing the vow, about sending their balance, through the land itself, the fields, the money, the bones of the house. Aunt Charity had warned them that any vow could twist back, but they were past warning. Outside, the night was breathless, the river as still as glass. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered over Louisiana. In his own study, Dr. Ridley closed his journal for the night and locked it in a drawer. His last note read, "Next test scheduled to coincide with expected delivery in the house. Observation to confirm or disprove transfer." He had no idea that what he called an observation would be remembered, if remembered at all, as the night Magnolia Bend lost its soul. The night Ridley chose for his observation came wrapped in thunder. Upstairs, in a second-floor bedroom with the curtains drawn tight, Mary Harrow labored on blood-damp sheets. Her face shone with sweat, hair stuck to her temples. Harrow paced between the bed and the door, shirt half-buttoned, jaw clenched. Reverend Greeley sat in a corner chair with his Bible open, mouthing psalms under his breath. Down near the kitchen, in the low room that had become both cabin and cage, Lena had begun to cramp hours earlier. Lila, only partway along in her own term, felt a shadow echo of the pain, hands pressed to her middle. Samuel and Jonah hovered uselessly, helpless in a space built for barrels and flour, not for vows and birth. Ridley moved between the two worlds, boots on the stairs, stethoscope swinging like a pendulum. He listened at Mary's swollen belly, a heartbeat, faint and stumbling. He checked Lena's, then Lila's. The numbers in his head did not comfort him. "We'll steady her," he told Harrow softly. "Slow the labor. Give the child time." He drew laudanum from a bottle and slid the needle in with practiced hands. Within minutes, Mary's cries faded to low moans, her contractions spacing out. Upstairs, the room exhaled. The men felt they had done something. Below, the effect was the opposite. As the house quieted, Lena's body clenched hard enough to lift her hips from the pallet. Lila grabbed her sister's arm, teeth bared. "It's pulling," she gasped, "like something trying to drag through both of us." Ridley, returning to the lower room with his notebook, saw the timing and went pale. He counted breaths, checked the pulse in Lena's neck. It hammered. When Greeley's voice floated faintly through the floorboards, intoning, "Thy will be done," Lena arched and screamed. Upstairs, the baby's heartbeat faltered, then disappeared altogether beneath Ridley's listening cone. He waited, holding his own breath, and heard only Mary's ragged lungs and the soft rustle of linen. "It's gone," he said, barely louder than the storm. Below, at that same moment, Lena felt a sudden shift. The pain that had locked her seemed to open like a door. Samuel, wild-eyed, leaned over her and shouted at no one he could name. "If you must take from them now, and leave us something." There was one long, suspended instant where it felt as if the house itself stopped. Then the child came, slick and furious, into Aunt Charity's hands. He howled, full-throated, as if he'd been waiting for that breath for years. The cry rose through the boards. Harrow heard it while his dead grandson lay still on the bed behind him. Later, in the small, cramped pages he kept for himself, Ridley wrote, "White infant expired near the hour, a Negro boy below first drew air." After so many parallels, I cannot write accidental without knowing I lie. For Harrow, there was no nuance. To him, the pattern collapsed into a single theft. "They're stealing my bloodline," he hissed, staring down toward the kitchen wing as if his gaze alone could burn through brick. "They rob my house of children and fill their hut with them, like thieves in the dark." Greeley, shaken more than he would admit, seized on righteousness to steady himself. "This is not theft, it is temptation," he said. "The devil using their bodies to mock Christian order. You must put a stop to it. Discipline, separation, whatever it takes. If necessary, an example that will end the talk." In the quarters, word moved before dawn. By the time the sun pushed through the trees, everyone knew. The upstairs baby had died. The downstairs baby lived. Some shook their heads in awe, some in fear. "That child been paid for twice," an old man muttered. "Once in her pain, once in that dead white crib." Aunt Charity sat beside Lena's pallet, watching the newborn's fists open and close. "You asked the world to even the scales," she said quietly. "It heard you. But every measure it pours passes through your flesh first. Remember that when the price comes round again." Ridley did his own remembering in ink. He began a letter to a colleague in Jackson, describing a most troubling series of observations on one plantation, then stopped halfway down the page. He saw, as clearly as if it were already written, how those words could return to drown him. He folded the paper, unsigned, and slid it between the journal covers instead. After that night, Magnolia Bend could no longer pretend it was dealing with superstition whispered in the quarters. Men with education, with pulpits and purses, had seen enough to know something real was moving between house and cabin. They stood at a fork with only two roads. Admit what they'd witnessed, or bury it so deep that only scars and rumors would remain. You already know, from the way these stories travel, which one they chose. By dawn, Magnolia Bend sounded like two different worlds sharing one yard. In the big house, the shutters were half closed, black crepe tied on the front knob. Servants moved on soft feet. Mary lay turned to the wall, a wet cloth over her eyes. Somewhere behind a closed door, a small wooden box was being hammered together. Down by the kitchen wing, a newborn's cry cut through the morning stillness, strong, insistent, uninterested in who owned the land under his mother's back. Harrow stood between house and quarters and heard both sounds at once. His face had the drained look of a man who has not slept and does not intend to. When Ridley approached, hat in hand, he didn't greet him. "You will not speak," Harrow said quietly. "Not to anyone. In your book, you will write that my grandson died of, what did you call it? Complications. And that is all." Ridley swallowed. "And the other child, sir?" "The other child is just another Negro birth," Harrow answered. "If it has to be written, it will be written that way." In the official register, Ridley obeyed. He entered a neat line. "Male infant, white, stillborn due to labor complications." No mention of time, no mention of downstairs. In the plantation ledger, the overseer added a brief note near the bottom of the page. "Male child born, quarters." No mother, no father, no mark to tie that line to the night above it. Greeley, in his church notebook, recorded only, "Called to comfort grieving household." His hand hovered over the thought of the four down by the kitchen, then moved on. Later, alone, he tore out the page and burned it in a small iron pan, as if that could erase the memory in his own head. Ridley went a step further with his private notes. Sitting at a narrow desk, he reread the sentences he had written in the small, fearful hours. Then he carefully lifted several leaves from the binding, folded them twice, and fed them to the fire. The rest he locked in a tin box. The line that remained, tucked deep in the journal, was just vague enough to deny. "Series of births and deaths on Magnolia Bend suggests troubling pattern." In the slave quarters, no one needed ink to remember. They had seen the upstairs lanterns flaring, heard the Bible verses, then the silence, then the infant wail from below. Stories didn't have to be invented, they simply walked from tongue to tongue. Harrow responded the only way he knew, by tightening the vise. He forbade gatherings after dark. Drumming, prayer circles, even quiet talking outside the cabins drew shouts from the overseer. He ordered the older children of Samuel, Jonah, Lena, and Lila, sent to separate sleeping sheds, to break bad habits. He spoke often of selling Jonah down the river, and hinted to Mary that one of the black babies might be brought into the house as a playmate, to be trained properly, though he never said which one. To the four in the kitchen room, every new rule felt less like discipline and more like fingers trying to pick apart a knot. Beyond Magnolia Bend's fence, the larger world cracked open. Mississippi seceded. Men in gray rode past with banners and songs. Word of battles on distant fields came back in crooked letters and half-drunk rumors. Cotton prices lurched. Confederate officers requisitioned mules and fodder. A line in Harrow's bank correspondence used a phrase he hated, distressed property. Against that backdrop, he decided on one more attempt to free himself of the Knott family. A trader passing through Natchez agreed to come for Jonah. Cash now, delivery in the morning, paperwork to follow when the roads were safer. Ruth heard it first in the kitchen and carried it to the low room like a coal in her apron. "They mean to take you at sunup," she told Jonah. "Mister says the sooner you gone, the sooner this place can breathe." That night, while most of Magnolia Bend tried to sleep off fear and hunger, 4 people slipped out toward the river. The water moved slow and black under a sky with no moon. They stood in a circle under the same cypress where they had once made their secret vow. This time there was no candle. Only their hands found each other in the dark. Samuel spoke first. "We tied our hurt to theirs," he said. "Now they coming for you. If we can take it back, we take it back tonight." Lena's voice shook. "I don't want no more children bought with other people's graves," she whispered. "Not even theirs." Lila, who had always felt the pull stronger than she could name, closed her eyes. "Then we ask whoever listened to us before to listen again," she said. "Not to save them, to spare our own." They tried, clumsy and desperate, to loosen the words they'd once bound so tightly, saying out loud that they released any claim on the lives in the big house, begging that the bond stop taking from above just to keep breathing below. Aunt Charity's warnings rang in their ears, but she was too old to make it to the river. They were alone with whatever they had called down. Samuel had just started to speak the last line when a lantern snapped open behind them. The overseer's assistant, rifle over his shoulder, barked their names. "Back to your beds," he ordered. "Master wants you rested. Man's coming at first light." No one argued. The river took their unfinished words and folded them into its surface. Morning came with a gray, wet light. The 4 waited in the yard, Jonah with a small bundle of things he wouldn't be allowed to keep. The trader never appeared. By noon, a Confederate courier rode in, splattered with mud. He brought news of a skirmish downriver, a burned bridge, patrols on the main road. "Traffic's cut," he said. "Your buyer won't be crossing for a while." In the county record book, the clerk later entered a short note beside Jonah's name. "Proposed transfer delayed. Military conditions." No follow-up line ever closed the sentence. Jonah stayed. The knot held. And Magnolia Bend rolled on into war with its most dangerous piece of unfinished business, still sitting right there, breathing under its own roof. The war changed everything and nothing. By 1863, Magnolia Bend had emptied of its younger white men. Edward Harrow's eldest, half paralyzed from that fall years before, was dead from fever. The second was off fighting near Vicksburg. The fields went to weeds. The cotton gin stood quiet. Only the old, the sick, and the enslaved remained to keep the property breathing. Confederate riders came and went, taking corn, mules, barrels of meal. Harrow paid them with forced smiles, and then took the shortage out of the hides of those who still bent their backs in his fields. The river cabin, though watched, had become the center of what life remained. Samuel, Jonah, Lena, and Lila still worked by day, but at night their room turned into something else, half sick room, half shrine. People crept there with fevers and sores, convinced that a touch of the Knott family could draw the sickness out. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the patient woke easy breathing, and Samuel would whisper that maybe their misery was finally being used for good. But the cost came fast. After every healing, the 4 woke aching, their skin blistered, their hearts heavy. Aunt Charity, too weak to stand, warned them that they were feeding the bond with their own strength. "You giving it more rope to pull," she said. "It won't stop at what you ask." Meanwhile, upstairs, Harrow's world collapsed. His ledgers made no sense. Debts changed hands without his say. Twice he dreamed of his house floating down the river, its windows full of candles. When he woke, he'd smell smoke that wasn't there. Ridley, older and thinner, returned in uniform gray, a field surgeon now. He came to settle his accounts before the army moved again. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air in the house seemed to tighten. He found Harrow at the library desk, muttering over papers. "You kept my journals," Ridley said. Harrow gestured toward the drawer. "Yours." All of it ends here. Ridley opened the drawer. The tin box was there, but lighter than before. Someone had removed the folded leaves he'd burned and replaced them with blank sheets. The fire scars on the inside lid gleamed. You destroyed the evidence, Ridley said quietly. I destroyed poison, Harrow snapped. You'd rather see my name printed in some Yankee paper? They didn't hear the first crash until the second followed. Plaster splitting, a sound like the earth shifting underfoot. Outside, clouds rolled in, heavy and electric. Downstairs, Samuel had dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. Jonah tried to steady him, but the same pain knifed through his ribs. Lila screamed that her skin was burning. Lena's mouth opened in a wordless cry, blood threading from her nose. The storm broke. Wind tore branches off the pecan trees. Rain hammered the roof. In the big house, the chandelier shook itself loose, shattering on the floor. Harrow staggered to the window, shouting for the servants to shut the shutters, but the hinges had already given way. Water poured through. Ridley, crossing the threshold, saw it happen. The instant a bolt hit the roof beam above the kitchen wing. Fire jumped from timber to timber. The smell of resin and pitch spread like breath. He ran for the stairs. Harrow shouted something behind him that the thunder swallowed. Smoke already filled the corridor. By the time Ridley reached the bottom step, the kitchen wall was a sheet of flame. The air shrieked with heat. He saw, through the gap, the four shapes on the floor. Twisting, half-lit, the children huddled in the corner. The light flickered over them like water. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the wind shifted. The roof above the kitchen collapsed inward, a single groan of timber giving up. In that collapse, something impossible happened. The blaze that should have swept through the whole house seemed to fold in on itself, burning down instead of out. When Ridley looked again, the fire was dying, smothered by rain and its own smoke. At dawn, the plantation still stood, half charred, half alive. The kitchen wing was gone. The cabin beneath it was ash. No bodies were found, only a fused shape of metal. 4 interlocked nails twisted into a ring. Harrow sat in the wet yard, staring at it. Ridley tried to speak. You can say you survived, he offered. Harrow didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the river, where the water carried thin streaks of soot. In the weeks that followed, soldiers came through, then Union scouts. The freed people left in 2s and 3s. Harrow's name appeared once more in the county register. Estate pending. Dr. Ridley vanished into the war's retreating lines, but people in the county kept talking. They said that on certain nights, when lightning flashed over the bend, the outline of the old house glowed faint and unburned, and from the riverbank came the cry of a child that was never buried. In the ruins, beneath a slab of cracked brick, someone found a small pouch of linen, roots, salt, and hair turned white with age. Aunt Charity's handwork. The ledger ended there, ink bleeding into the rain. And Magnolia Bend became another name that the map forgot. But the river never did.